My name is Kayla. I'm 22 years old and I don't really have a hometown. My parents moved a lot, but the majority of my life I was raised in Hemet, California, so I guess you could call that my hometown. My story takes place in a small town in Nevada called Tonopah. My story is 100% real, I wouldn't lie. Tonopah is a small town in the middle of the desert. It was very prevalent with gold back in the old days, but as soon as it was mined out and the gold seekers continued west, the population went down to maybe 1,000. We moved into an apartment complex and my mother was the night auditor at the Ramada Inn. My mother was very depressed from the divorce and took to her old ways of partying and using. Without adult supervision, my older sister became pretty wild too. My mother and sister began to fight so badly that at times it turned physical. So she went to live with my dad in Reno, Nevada. After Kim left, my mother still worked at the graveyard shift until 2 a.m. And even then, sometimes she wouldn't return home. She would be out with friends until the next day, so I was left alone a lot. That's when all the paranormal incidences started to happen. I don't believe the apartment was haunted. I believed all the bad things happening and the depression invited something dark into our lives. Darkness likes darkness. Anyway, the first thing that started happening was the intense feeling of being watched. It didn't matter if it was day or night, you were being watched, and not only from within the room, it also felt like there were things outside watching you through the windows. This became so uncomfortable to me that my mother and I switched rooms. It didn't help, I still felt like I was being watched. So I started sleeping on the couch, which was right next to the front door, so if I needed to escape quickly, I could. But one day I was walking from the couch to the kitchen to fix myself something to eat. To my right was a hallway, and at the end was a bathroom, with my mother's room on the left, and mine was on the right. While I was walking to the kitchen, I couldn't help but look down the hallway, when I saw a huge dark figure run from my mother's room into my room. It didn't really run, more like hovered. It didn't touch the floor, but it was very, very quick, that's why I say it ran. It was also tall enough to touch the ceiling with the top of its head. And it was very dark, I couldn't see through it at all. Well, me being 9 or 10, I was totally freaked out. I also began losing sleep. The only time I would sleep is when I went to visit my mom at work. I would literally sleep at her feet behind her desk at work. My mother did start to worry about me, and she said she felt the watching eyes as well. But she had to work to keep food on the table. The only relief she would offer was to tell me to come visit her at work. One day I invited a friend over so I wouldn't be so scared. But when she came over, she started feeling creeped out, so we stood on the porch and talked. As we were talking, we could hear someone coming from behind the apartment. There were leaves on the ground, so we could hear them getting closer. People used to walk by all the time, so we weren't really scared. But as the sound of the steps got closer and closer, we realized no one was there. We actually saw the leaves being pressed down in the shape of a foot, but there was nobody. And the steps were coming right for us, so we screamed our heads off and ran to her house. The last incident that happened to me in that apartment was when I was laying down to go to bed, in my bedroom. I wanted to sleep, but I couldn't. I felt very strongly that someone was watching me. I felt they were looming over me. So I turned my back to it and put the covers over my head. Then I felt pressure on the bed like someone got into the bed with me, and it whispered something in my ear. But it was very quick and a whisper, so I couldn't tell if it said my name Kayla or wake up. It was in a woman's voice. I was all alone, frozen in fear, but I eventually fell asleep. A few months later we moved, not out of town but away from those apartments. This was definitely the scariest thing I've ever been through. It was late September in 1996, a month short of my 36th birthday, when due to some turmoil in my life I found myself asking an old friend if I could stay a while at his flat. He was actually a distant relative on my mother's side and was about 16 years older than me. Like me, his name was Mick. He lived a few miles south in our small fishing town in the east of England. Although I didn't want to be there and Mick didn't want me there, he was good enough to let me stay. Mick liked to drink cheap cider, that rough industrial stuff that has never seen an apple. I like a few beers in bars but don't drink much at home, so he mostly drinks alone. I just enjoyed watching the TV with him while he drank a 2-liter bottle almost every night. I spent 2 uncomfortable weeks trying to sleep on Mick's 2-seater cottage settee. I was unable to stretch out, but I'd been homeless before, so I wasn't complaining. A week earlier, Mick had offered to sleep on the settee while I got a decent night's sleep in his bed, but I declined his offer, thinking I shouldn't take his bed on top of being a burden. On my last night there, Mick had some cider while I got my head down around 11:30, and I had fallen asleep before Mick finished watching TV. I awoke, I'd say, about 1 o'clock with a slight feeling of unease, no more than a feeling, but the lights were still on, the TV was off. Then I was surprised to notice Mick laid on the floor as close to the settee as he could get. It was odd, but I assumed he'd ended up there because he drunk too much. Then I fell back asleep. Next I awoke with a start. I thought it must be around 3 o'clock and I was quite awake. It was like a charged atmosphere, like electricity was around. Then I gasped in pure horror as dashing into view from behind the armchair from the right to the left, close to the wall opposite, was what I could only describe as a goblin. It dashed along beneath the windowsill towards the TV area in the left corner, covering 3 to 4 feet in a second. Then, without moving its head or looking where it was going, and without making a sound, it dodged between the coffee table and TV, then stood at Mick's feet looking down at him. It was now about 4 feet from my face, about only a foot distance from the settee. I tried to call out Mick as soon as I spotted it, but all I could muster out was a muted murmur. I tried again but could make no sound, and I realized I was paralyzed in fear. This thing was about 2.5 feet tall, with the head about the size of a man's, and I vaguely remember a small body about the size of a large doll's. It had very long arms from elbows to wrists, and it had to hold its arms out parallel to the floor because they were so long, about half as long as our own. Its knees were bent and it was bobbing on its toes as though standing still. It was unbalanced. I didn't notice if it was naked or clothed because my gaze was drawn to its eyes, which were large and yellowed. If you hold your middle fingers to your thumbs, about an inch apart, they were that big, and they even appeared slightly bloodshot. It had human features but very ugly and grotesque. All its facial features were enlarged. Big eyes, big ears, thick lips, even prominent teeth. I was terrified, and I just remember hoping it wouldn't touch me, or I think I would have died. It looked at me briefly, like it was satisfied to have frightened someone. Then, to my utter relief, it turned, and again in total silence, it dashed back the way it came, dodging between the TV and coffee table and beneath the windowsill until it disappeared out of the line of sight behind the armchair. As soon as it was out of sight, I found I could move, and I quickly shook Mick awake. Once he awoke, I was no longer alone, and I didn't say what I'd just experienced. I didn't know if he would dismiss it or become frightened, so I just asked him if he was alright down there on the floor. In the morning, I left Mick's house, and within a few weeks, I got my own flat. But it was another 5 or so months, not until the lighter nights of spring, that I was able to sleep without the lights on. I did try, but in the dark I thought about that goblin, and was afraid thought might attract it. I think it was attracted to Mick because of his drinking, like a pink elephant, a drink demon. I got the impression it wasn't an evil spirit, just mischievous, and enjoyed giving humans a fright. I also wondered if a long time ago, maybe back in the days of the Druids a couple thousand years before Christ, if that spirit was once a man, probably a very unpleasant man. I think that spirit was the reason Mick offered me his bed, and why he was laid on the floor that night next to the settee. It haunted him, came looking for him, and if so, there was no wonder he was frightened. I always intended to ask Mick about it sometime, but he gave up his flat to move into his brother's sometime after. A few years later he died, so I never got to ask him. Though I did ask an uncle of mine who stayed there after Mick. He was a drinker too. He said he didn't see anything, and I believe him. I was 19 and home on leave from the military. This occurred after September 11th, and my training had eliminated all fear from my body of anything frightening. I was a rock, until I went to stay at my best friend's house. Her mom was a single mother on assistance, and they put her up in an old farmhouse in an orchard. She had 2 younger brothers and a younger sister. We stayed up late talking, and then they told me I had to sleep in the servant quarters off the kitchen. They told me it was sort of cut off from the rest of the house because in 1919 when it was built, the people owned a lot of servants that they didn't want seen by the guests. They both exchanged a knowing glance, and I went up the winding back steps to the servant's bedroom. I was uncomfortable and had vertigo upon entering, but paid it not much thought, and dropped off to sleep. I was awoken by a terribly sad crying and wailing. I went to sit up when something dropped onto my back. It was very heavy and I immediately tried to get up, but it laid its full weight on me. It wailed and cried in my ear. I began to panic, but just when I pushed up with all my might, it let go. I sat up swinging my feet down and went for my handgun in my bag. I carried a 9mm Glock. As I bent down over my bag, I saw something crouched in the dark corner. I stood up to get a better look and his face turned to me. It was a small boy in a black suit. He had a white, tear-stained face. He said, "Please don't let him kill her," and he looked behind me. I whipped around and was faced with a woman in a bridal gown. She lifted her veil to reveal a rotten skeletal face. I reached down for my gun and pulling it out ran straight toward her, and not stopping ran straight through her and down the servant steps. I ran to my friend's mom's bedroom. She was not asleep. Her and my friend had all the lights on and were sitting there smoking cigarettes on the bed. Her mom looked at me and said, "Did you see the bride or the boy?" I answered in a soft whisper, "Both." I sat down with them. They told me about people seeing them, and guests they had over that never stayed long in there. I was angry at first. I had never seen or experienced anything so terrifying in my life, and I had seen some pretty horrible things in the military. I went back to the sandpit a few weeks later, and when I came home for good 4 years later, I visited my friend in their house. They had stayed only another month after my visit. We went back to the house and it was empty with the for sale sign in front. I am now 33. I check it out every now and then. It no longer has a sign. It's condemned. I attest to every facet of the story being true. And to this day, when I think about it, I get vertigo and goosebumps. It changed me.